This session actually was born out of an advisory board breakfast that we had a while back, and actually I think you were part of that, weren't you? So thank you for that. The idea was to really look at policy, what feeds into it, how you can influence it from a number of different perspectives, both the sort of lawmaking process and also the information on which it depends. So to look at that, Baroness Bryony Worthington, as well as being a peer in the House of Lords, she is Executive Director for Europe at Environmental Defence Fund, and Keisuke Sadamori, Director of Energy Markets and Security at the International Energy Agency, based in Paris, obviously originally from Japan. Bryony, if I could start with you, what have you learnt in the House of Lords in terms of influencing policy?
That the House of Lords is great. that actually, when it comes to British politics, the House of Lords is possibly an underlooked part of the equation, because it is the place where we get to go through every single line of every legislation, line by line, and we debate all the amendments that are tabled. And you're dealing with a group of people who are freed from constituency concerns and who've got a long view of life, usually. They've got a long backward history, and they're freed from the election cycle. So it's a really great place to debate and discuss ideas and actually to win votes, because as you know, the composition of the House of Lords is very different to the Commons. So we have actually in the opposition parties, they can overturn the government.
So do you think those who would seek to influence policy have not quite realised this to the extent that they might? We're not bombarded with.
I think there's a fair amount of lobbying that goes on, so I think people are aware of it. But I think perhaps there are certain aspects of civil society that perhaps don't know how to engage with the Lords, because you know it's not obviously we don't have constituencies. So how do you speak to?
So let's take a sort of worked example of this. You've got a transport bill going through the process at the moment. How does that work? When is the stage that you actually need to bend people's ears, and how do you set about finding out who the right person to talk to is?
So, I mean, the best thing is Hansard. Hansard is a great resource. You can look through and see who's interested in different topics, and every word spoken is recorded. But, I mean, really, you've got to keep your eye on the forthcoming business and know when bills are being tabled. Once you know that, then there's a sort of metronome of activity.
So when's the right moment? You don't want to be too early.
You don't want to be too early. No, about a week before, I think. About a week before.
Wow, you've got to be quite... That means you've got to be very switched on to the parliamentary.
Oh yeah. And this bill you just mentioned, the transport bill, it's been in gestation for years, but it actually arrived in the Commons a little bit too quick for people, so it didn't get much attention, and it sort of went through its usual fairly perfunctory process in the Commons, and we're looking at it now. So
do you actually think? Would you argue that it's in the Lords where people can have outside influences, can affect things more than in the Commons? Is that right?
I don't think it's more, because the Commons ultimately is supreme. And everyone who works on bills knows that there's usually a consultation phase before the legislation, and you've got to engage with the civil servants, because they're the kind of continuous process that run the bills. Ministers are there as well, obviously, to be influenced. But you kind of have to, you should engage as early as possible on that aspect. But you can still influence it at any stage when it's going through. So, ideally you have a well-paid set of people who are tracking this for you. But the problem with sustainability is that the people who are trying to disrupt the incumbents don't have that kind of resource. They're not paying for professional lobbyists. They don't have the sort of spare capacity because they're busy innovating. So that's where groups like the Environmental Defence Fund and other NGOs can come in, because we can act as a conduit into that fairly complex process and sort of shortcut some of the resource needs. So that's why NGOs and civil society groups are really essential, because they do track these things and can be a good way for industry or disruptive and new entrants to influence.
If I were, speaking now as a citizen,
you'd probably think, why are the unelected Lords?
Yeah, I was going to say, is this a good thing, or is this a slightly scary thing in terms of democratic accountability and control? Is this how the system should work? Or are you describing just how the system does work, warts and all?
I would wish that the Commons was better at doing legislative scrutiny, because they should do a more thorough job. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of British democratic process, is that the Commons are not well resourced enough, and the committee stages are not as detailed as they should be.
And what about the quality of lobbyists? How would you rate lobbyists? I mean, you are one yourself in a sense.
I lobby myself every day. Yeah.
You lobby yourself but you also have worked for a number of lobbying outfits. Are you shocked at how brilliant they are, or shocked at how terrible they are generally, or neither?
Lobbying is a fact of life. I think if you compare it to the United States, it's possibly quite a gentle experience here. The power of argument is still still really important. There are obviously, as we've just seen today, right? There are manipulative forces amongst us. The digital revolution that we're all experiencing has brought us great advances, but also lots of risks. And so we've got to be alive to that. And the people who are being lobbied need to be digitally literate and open-minded, and go out and seek wider voices, because too often it does get narrowed down to just a handful of trusted circles, and that's always a little bit worrying.
So that relates to my last question before moving on to Keisuke, that as between channeling efforts in the rather narrow direction of influencing a piece of legislation that's going through the mill, which is very, very targeted by definition, to the broader thing of winning hearts and minds in the public, and perhaps getting mass media attention or social media campaigns going. What's the balance that, presumably it depends on the topic and the organisation and its aims, but do you have to do a bit of both, or are there difficult choices here as to where to direct efforts most effectively?
So, a word on why. I work on legislation and policy because it lifts the floor for everybody. And what I worry about is this temptation to just look at the best performing people in a sector and say, oh, we're doing really well. That might be my mic, sorry. And that, that's just not good enough. It's great to have leaders, but actually we need to lift the floor for everybody, because there will always be people who will flow counter-cyclically against the trend. And in climate change, we can't afford that. We've got to get everybody moving. I think Macron just said this morning, we need to regulate everyone. And that's why laws are so important, because they apply to everybody. But to have a successful legislative campaign, you need to win hearts and minds, you need to make a noise, and you need, for politicians to act, you need to up the pain of non-delivery and increase the gain if they do deliver. And that means they need to feel rewarded for listening and doing what you've asked them to do, and they need to know that if they don't do the right thing, there'll be consequences, and that means engagement with public.
Now, Keisuke, you come in at this at a rather different level. You're not lobbying. You're providing information, and I guess part of your argument would be that providing good information is the way to produce good policy. But we can have a discussion about what is good information and how reliable the information is. Could you describe how you go about producing that information? You've just come out with a new report that gives new data on carbon, the state of play in carbon.
Yes, thank you. First of all, International Energy Agency is a group of 30 member countries. They're all the OECD member countries who try to cooperate and help each other in order to come up with the better energy policies which explore secure, affordable, and sustainable the energy. And the report that you talked about is just what we released today. It is called the Global Energy and the CO2 Status Report, and which looked into what happened in terms of the energy demand and CO2 emission last year in 2017. And the finding is that after 3 years of stagnation of the CO2 emission levels, we saw the uptick, the growth of CO2 emission by 1.4%, and energy demand grew by 2%. And there are actually 4 countries who reduced the CO2 emission. First one is, of course, the UK. And also the largest contribution came from the United States in terms of the CO2, the amount of CO2 decreased. And also other countries are Mexico, and also one is Japan. And I'm really happy to learn that my home country reduced the CO2 emission thanks to the renewable growth and also the restart of the nuclear power plants. And
How do you explain the US reduction? What's the...
That's mostly the two parts. One is the field switching, continued field switching from coal to gas, and also the substantial renewable deployment growth. So they are the contributors. And, but at the same time, that this means that, of course, the economy grew, the GDP growth was good, and we cannot blame that. Having said so, we also point to, in this report, about the slowing down of the efficiency improvements. And this is actually what we warned in the last year's our energy efficiency market report. So we have been seeing quite a good energy efficiency improvement, the lower energy intensity, by more than 2% in the past several years. But we are right now concerned about the kind of lack of new measures introduced by various countries around the world, and also the stringency of those efficiency measures is not improving so fast. And therefore, we are now seeing the kind of the efficiency improvements, which was at the pace of more than 2% in the past several years, is now in the last year, it slowed down to 1.some%. So, so in that respect, we've been giving warning to the countries around the world that they have to work harder and bringing more better the energy efficiency standards, and also the work on the incentive mechanism.
So just to be clear, the figures that you were talking about, is that only your member countries, or is it all countries in the world?
Of course, our member countries are 30. The advanced economies, and but now they cover only minor portion of the energy demand as a whole.
Yeah, but when you said that it was going up again, is that the global?
That's about the global.
So the increase is presumably accounted for mainly by countries in the emerging market, the big growing economies.
I would say both, because we have, so for instance, China has been a major contributor in terms of the renewable deployment growth. About the 40% of additional renewable is coming from the China, one country. But also, in our efficiency report, we pointed out quite a good performance by the Chinese government in terms of increasing energy efficiency in the past years. So we've been trying to cover all those, the global, the energy indicators. And so, of course, there are plenty of rooms to improve the efficiency in emerging economies. But at the same time, I think that both the advanced economies and the emerging economies, they both have to work harder on the.
So I want to come back to the sort of core theme of influencing policy, and your members are OECD economies. But as you say, you know, it's now not the largest part of the issue. The largest part is elsewhere. So you have to presumably make sure that if you want to influence policy, that your message is also reaching the broad governments elsewhere. So how are you going about that?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the point. And the recent energy demand and CO2 emission growth, they're coming mostly from the emerging economies, in particular China, India, and other Asian emerging economies. And therefore, we've been trying hard to enhance our outreach activities. So we established a system called the Association Membership of the IEA. And right now, China, Indonesia, India, Thailand, Singapore, Morocco, and Brazil, they are what we call the association members. So we've been trying hard to work with the governments of those countries and try to learn from each other about how we can improve the energy policies.
Bryony, if I could bring you in here, because we were having a bit of a discussion earlier, and you seem to think that, I may be paraphrasing this incorrectly, so correct me if this is wrong, but that some of these numbers are part of the problem, not part of the solution. Is that unfair, or is that how you see things?
Well, I mean, I don't want to. I mean, the IEA is a very robust organisation, but I think there is a danger between people conflate empirical evidence, or in fact, often it's estimates, right? But very thorough estimates of current situation and historical situation with forecasts and projections. And what we sometimes see. And it's not, the IEA is not unique in this, is that modelling forward in a world where everything's being disrupted is really difficult. And almost all forecasters got the rise of renewables wrong. And I think there's an inherent conservatism. Some of the IEA's forecasts, for example, on fossil fuel demand, because the IEA's members, some of them have got a vested interest in maintaining stability in those markets. So it's kind of convenient if you say, oh, it's okay, coal demand is staying steady, everyone, it's okay. Well, I think that happens to be completely wrong. I think that fuel switch that you're seeing in the US is going to be quickly followed by fuel switching in China and India and elsewhere, because we're going to reach price parity where it's quicker and easier to do it different ways. So I think you've got to be really careful as policymakers, and unfortunately your numbers do get used by lobbyists to say, everything's fine, we've got to keep ploughing money into the fossil fuel industry because we're meeting a demand that the IEA says is there. And that's when data is...
Couldn't you also throw the same accusation at the environmental lobby and say they've been guilty of using always the worst possible, scariest scenarios in order to frighten policymakers into action? I mean, that's part of the lobbying game.
No, because, organisations like the Environmental Defence Fund make an absolute priority on providing positive solutions. So we're not part of the scaremongering gang. In fact, I find that very off-putting. But what we are seeing increasingly is that the people who are the most worried are the scientists. And I think your research is probably going to say that the most trusted source of information is independent research. And the scientific community right now is really alarmed. And actually the NGOs have all kind of toned themselves down because they've been hit by lots of denial stories, and actually the confidence in the NGO movement's been unnecessarily weakened. But the scientists are the ones who are now, got their head in their hands. So I think if anything, we're underplaying the problem.
Okay, Keisuke, I want to give you a chance to come back on the numbers, and
yeah.
also on other people's numbers as well, because there's a lot of argument over which numbers are the reliable ones to use.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for pointing out the very good aspect. Because, for instance, if we take a look at the example of our World Energy Outlook, we have what we call the new policy scenario, which is a central scenario, which may be interpreted as a kind of a future forecast, but it's actually not. So we've been trying to make sure that the people understand that this is not a forecast, but at the same time, if we take a look at the assumption or where this NPS, new policy scenario, is coming from, it's actually the kind of estimated the outcome of all of those commitments made under the Paris Agreement. So this shows that the current policy commitments will lead to this level. And actually, it doesn't lead to the demand, the peak in the fossil fuel demand. So in order for us to show that what would be actually needed to get us on track to the 2-degree scenario, we at the same time present the what we call the sustainable development scenario, which shows what is needed to achieve the 3 elements of a sustainable development goal, which is the CO2 emission reduction, the anti-air pollution, the cleaner air, and also the universal energy access. And therefore, yeah, I think it's really important for us to make sure and make even kind of a clearer announcement what these scenarios mean. But I also would like to point out that the future of energy costs is not set in stone, and the critical factor would be the real, actual policy measures taken by the various governments around the world. And so we'd like you to understand that the scenarios in the World Energy Outlook shows the outcome depending on the future course of policy measures taken by the governments.
Okay, so let's open it up. I particularly would welcome questions, but also comments, because I know there's a great deal of expertise in the room and also knowledge about or advice about how you can influence policy as well. So please do ask questions, but also welcome comments. Yes, if you could stand up. Yes.
Yes. Carl Pendragon from Sky Mining. This question is to you, Mr. Sadamori. We really appreciate that you're measuring the emissions year by year, but I have a technical question. Are you also measuring the strong reduction in the ability of the oceans and the forest to reabsorb that carbon when it comes down? So for example, a gigaton 10 years ago, maybe half of it, I'm just using an example, would be reabsorbed by nature. Now it's maybe only 30%. Are you considering in your models that much less of that CO2 actually goes back down into the oceans and the natural systems, and are you accounting for that?
I think I need to ask those the real experts who is actually running this model. But we are good at taking the various energy data. So it's basically based on the amount of energy consumed in the particular year. So I'm not sure to what extent the sort of the absorption by the sea is incorporated in this model. I'm sorry about this.
So probably the answer to your question is no. I take it from that the measuring the emissions but not the absorption, so not necessarily the net effect. But
okay, can I just comment on that? Because I mean, I think actually we are not measuring climate change impacts at all well, and even the IPCC isn't doing a good job of it. Every 5 years they do a kind of peer review gathering of evidence and then publish that in a fairly impenetrable report, and it's not good enough. We need much more immediate feedback on what's happening, what the state of the planet is today, and whether our sinks are indeed weakening or not. What's the state of the ocean temperatures? We've just got one metric. We've got one metric that's very important, which is the parts per million. And that metric tells us that we're in deep trouble. Not only is it increasing, but the rate at which it's increasing is increasing. So that's the measure we should be watching. And the Paris challenge, the Paris sort of agreement is how do we get that equation solved where the sources of emissions are cancelled out entirely by the sinks sometime well before the end of the century. And that's the metric we should be. I mean, we haven't got the reporting mechanisms, we haven't even got the instruments yet to be able to tell how we're doing in solving that. And I think that's a real challenge for us as a global society to track and change, and we need to resource that properly, and it needs much more talking about, because the numbers, unfortunately, are all pretty ropey when you look at them.
Other thoughts, questions, comments? Right at the back there, yeah.
Ben Murray from Carbon Smart. In the UK, we've had a whole raft of policies around energy management, corporate reporting, and if there is a constant theme, it's that we keep changing them. And I just wonder how important you think it is that policy gets made and then stays put. So there's lots of willing businesses that want to comply and do the right thing, but if we keep changing the requirements, we keep changing the investment that's required from them to meet the requirements of regulation, you make it very hard for people to be supportive of these very important policies.
Yeah, I mean, long, loud and legal is the phrase a friend of mine coined for what you want with climate change policy. It's got to be over a long time scale, it's got to be backed by law, and it's got to be known and understandable. Yeah, constant sort of cycle of change. But that said, you know, in certain circumstances, you know, things do change, our knowledge changes. If you look at how we've brought renewables on in this country, and it has delivered significant reductions now, it came through at least 2, maybe 3 iterations of policy. Each one done in consultation with the industry. I suspect on the reporting side, it's probably just very, very annoying and time-consuming for the people who have to keep up with it. But but you can't. In some cases, I think some change has to just take account of our increasing knowledge.
We have a show of hands in the room. Who in this room is in some way or another seeking to influence policy on sustainability? That's kind of 70% of the room, I would think. How many of you have sought to do so through the House of Lords?
And how many of them know me?
So there's a gap anyway. There perhaps would suggest that not everybody, but maybe it's not all of the sorts of policies that are susceptible to influence through the House of Lords.
Yeah, exactly.
Also other countries here, yes. So it's not this was not a scientific sample. Any other questions or comments around these issues? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Marcus Gover from the Waste and Resources Action Programme. My question is about the different types of policy and different things you're trying to achieve. So in my role, I'm trying to win a food waste fight against food waste, but I'm also trying to win a fight against plastics. If I win one, I'll probably lose the other. So if I reduce plastic, I'll probably increase food waste. If I win the reducing food waste, I may increase plastic. And there's a big tension between some of these different policies. How do we get a more holistic approach to policy?
It's a good question, isn't it? Yeah, there are always trade-offs. I mean, the one I know best, the transport one we talked about, where we just had some horrendous trade-offs with, we try and do the right thing to bring emissions down in cars, and suddenly diesel comes back, and it's like, ugh. Or we've had it again in the power market. We bring in a fairly badly designed capacity market, and suddenly diesel generators pop up everywhere, and instead of what we want, which is much cleaner sources of concentrated power. So, yeah, the unintended consequences are a constant problem. But you have to have a set of legislative. The legislative body and the government need to just be constantly monitoring the outputs of what happens when they pass laws, and we need to invest more in not just passing laws, but then checking that they're doing the right thing and going back and reviewing and gathering the data. And most bills now get passed with some kind of reporting requirement in them, just to make sure that they're not passed and forgotten. But yeah, that's a tough one. Good luck.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think it's really important to be aware of the need for this comprehensive analysis, because there are some cases in various policy measures taken by the government that the policy is intended to address certain aspects of the environmental values, and then the measures actually invites unintended consequences of increasing the environmental burden in other parts of the economy. So I think that of course, it's really hard to come up with a real good comprehensive analysis of the kind of entire impact the environment, but at least we should be aware and modestly try to address how we can address those the environmental concerns and the economic the policies in the right manner.
I just had a second thought. We had a dinner last night where we discussed the advent of new tools, the sort of AI, machine learning, and big data. And it just struck me that one of the speakers said that soon we're going to have these artificial or augmented intelligent agents who can, be as fast as a postdoc in seconds, able to do a whole lifetime's worth of science in seconds. And it just struck me that some of these problems are just really complex, and actually we are going to have augmented intelligence and optimizing against multiple parameters. So in the world that I work in electricity markets, actually we've been solving for security on one side, climate on the other, and then price over here. It's totally ridiculous. And actually now we've got the kind of computing and data power to be able to solve all three as one. So have those kind of complex algorithms that will help us to do that. And it won't be human engineers picking up telephones, managing the grid. It will be printouts and automation that helps us know when to call what, and then we can get to our triple outcomes. So I think that's probably part of the answer.
I'm sure that's hopeful, and we can hope for better algorithms. Somehow I don't think it's ever going to be as simple as saying, computer, tell us the answer to life, the universe.
Yeah.
44, that's right. Yeah. This will probably have to be two more questions we'll take. This first one here, and then just here, sorry.
Peter Wheeler from the Nature Conservancy. We work closely, as you'll know, with the Environmental Defence Fund on lobbying in the United States, in all 50 states, and it's quite hard these days, obviously, in the federal government. But I just wanted to come back to this thing about sustainability. Yesterday at the Climate Bonds Initiative Conference, I was on a panel with Sir David King, another member of the House of Lords, and a very knowledgeable scientist about climate change. And he was making the point about climate change, which hasn't really been discussed here, which is that it is going to hit points of irreversibility. So this is not something that sort of gets gradually warmer year by year, and there'll be a few more extreme weather events every year. We've just about got through this year. At some point, the Greenland ice shelf could drop into the ocean, and that's 18 meters of sea level rise. That is catastrophic. And so while I am very sympathetic to people talking about ocean plastics, I do think there is a quantum difference between climate change, which could wipe out the future, literally, of our children and grandchildren, and other forms of pollution.
Okay. Sorry, I see two more. We've got two more here. So if you could keep them, yes. Why don't we take first here, yes, and then we'll. If you could keep them short, that would be good, because we're right up against our time limit.
Thank you. Michael Street, White Cube Projects. One thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is the accounting system, our GDP, which is becoming more and more sort of hotting up the debate. The UN have said we won't reach the SDGs unless we have another different accounting system The World Bank have just had a large report on trying to find out how we can move ahead, and there are more and more books coming out on this, on how to have a different sustainability accounting system. If you've any comments on that?
Let's go to the other one, and then we'll give our speakers.
Hello, this is Göktuğ Kara from EU delegation in Turkey. My question is also for the House of Lords, as we don't have one in Turkey. So, I mean, when you consider policy making, are you also, when you thinking about sustainability, do you look into aspects of poverty, education, gender, women empowerment? I mean, here since the morning, I think the discussion has been really focusing on economics and more on the responsibility of the corporates, the governments, but it didn't really elevate up to the international connection. So, I mean, what do you do on your side? Because if you ask me as a social scientist, I'm also teaching in Ankara in the university, I would start from poverty for the sustainability. But here, it was really a totally different angle. And it's very interesting to watch. But I would love to see what they are considering here in the UK.
That's quite a large resolution.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you like to have a go in about 1 minute?
For Peter from TNC, yeah, couldn't agree more, I'm afraid. Winning slowly is the same as losing, unfortunately, when it comes to climate change. And I don't think we're really across the urgency. I don't think it will slip off in one move. We'll have a bit of time, but not a lot of time. And the point about phase changing is absolutely correct. We can't rely on the history to tell us what's going to happen next. It's just we're into a new phase. On GDP, I think a lot of environmentalists are frustrated with this. But in a sense, there's no perfect way of doing it. I think we've got to internalise the externalities, absolutely, so that we're accounting for the things that we're not currently pricing. But it's above my pay grade to solve GDP, I'm afraid. And then poverty and gender. I mean, in our kind of view, obviously, you can't leave humans behind when you try and tackle any of these policies. And actually making policies sort of have the sensitivity to not make things worse, to exacerbate inequality or exacerbate poverty, is a big part of what clever policy does, so that you don't bring in regressive policies. On a global scale, clearly, the SDGs are all interrelated. We can't get rid of poverty if we have runaway climate change, and equally, you say they're all interrelated. So it is. I mean, it's the number one SDG, right? So it's got its place there, but it's a complex one to solve. And I think it's if we have lots of abundant, cheap, clean power, that actually will help. It's in the hands of the many and not in the few. I've just come back from Romania, where they have had hundreds and hundreds of years of oil and gas extraction, very, very valuable, still got awful poverty and inequality because they weren't like Norway, extracting that in a socially responsible way, and the taxation wasn't working. So there's clean energy and access to energy, and having all of society benefit from that will help lift poverty, I'm sure of it.
Very quickly, as to the last point raised, we agree that there's a kind of the multiple goals that we need to achieve in the Sustainable Development Goal. So we changed our scenario, which we used to call the 450 ppm scenario, to SDS scenario, in order to include the other elements. In particular, in case of energy, that's the universal energy access and also the air pollution. So that's how we try to address all those the energy-related, the sustainability issues, and so that's the first point. As for the accounting, yes, of course, it's really important, as she pointed out, that they internalize the externalities, but the system is really complex, and I think that there needs to be an enormous effort to actually achieve it. But at the same time, it's really important to actually introduce the specific measures to explore the kind of market-based solutions for the energy and environmental problems.
Yes.
Good. Well, Keisuke, Bryony, thank you very much indeed. Please.